To begin our discussion on social patterns, we'll start with population. Demography is the study of the size, composition, growth, and distribution of populations and the changes in them in response to birth, migration, aging, and death. Demographic analyses can be applied to whole societies or to just particular groups that are defined by criteria such as education, nationality, or religion. Thomas Malthus is a theorist who proposed the Malthus theorem. He argued that our population is growing much, much faster than our food supply. So he basically argued that our population is going to grow from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8, while our food supply is only increasing from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. Therefore, according to the Malthus theorem, if births go unchecked, our population is going to outstrip our food supply. The new Malthusians believe that Thomas Malthus was correct, and that the world's population is following an exponential growth curve, where numbers are increasing in extraordinary proportions. So as you can see, in 1800 there was 1 billion. Then 130 years later, 2 billion. Only 45 years later, 4 billion. And only 24 years later, 6 billion. According to the new Malthusians, our world population is growing so fast that by the time this lecture is done, another 40,000 babies will be born. And by this time tomorrow, there will be another 225,000 babies born. And this terrifies the new Malthusians because they argue that we will run out of food if we do not curtail our population growth. The anti-Malthusians, on the other hand, believe that people do not blindly reproduce until there is no room left. Rather, they cite these 4 stages of demographic transition. They say that this took place in Europe as an example, and it will continue to do so throughout the world. So stage 1 is a fairly stable population where there are high birth rates that offset high death rates. Then population explosion takes place in stage 2. So there's a high birth rate that is and low death rates. Population increases. But then there is population stability in stage 3. So low birth rates and low death rates. And finally is shrinkage in stage 4, so that the death rate is larger than the birth rate. Here's an example of the demographic transition in a graph view. So, as you can see, within the demographic transition, this shows that the demographic transition, which sociologists have linked to the population change of different societies, and they're linking this to technological advancements. And as you can see, exactly as proposed, stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they assert that the least industrialized nations, which are currently in the second state, are going to follow this transition. So then there's the question, well then why are people starving in our world? Does the world produce enough food to feed everyone? Anti-Malthusians note that the amount of food produced for each person in the world has actually increased. So there is more food today in the world than there was in 1950. They also acknowledge that the world's population has since doubled. But in turn, they say that we have improved our seeds and fertilizer. And so now we have more food available for each person on this earth. Famines are not the result of too little food production throughout the world, but rather from the global misdistribution of food. For example, there are droughts and wars that cause opposing sides to burn and steal crops, and farmers flee to cities. So while Africa is often hit with these droughts and wars, the United States government actually takes part in paying farmers to reduce their crops because in the United States there is too much food, whereas in Africa there is too little food. The new Malthusians would counter this argument and argue that as the world's population continues to grow, the Earth may not be able to continue to produce such sufficient food supply. Again, it's important to understand and remember that this is due to a maldistribution or misdistribution of food. When we look at population growth, we know that starvation is the result of poor distribution of food rather than overpopulation. from the situation in Africa, but we also know that the population of these least industrialized nations is growing at a rate of 13 times faster than the most industrialized nations, such as the United States. At that rate, the least industrialized nations will double their population in 40 years, whereas it will take 500 years to double the population of the most industrialized nations. There are a few reasons as to why people in these least industrialized nations have so many children. First is that parenthood provides status. Motherhood is said to be one of the most exalted statuses for a woman in these countries. So the more children they have, the higher the status. Similar for males. Second, the community supports this view by awarding or withholding status based on the number of children born. And finally, children are seen as an economic asset since their parents rely on their children to take them in old age. And also, they may be sent out to work much earlier, contributing to the income of those families. Demographers use sex ratios. Sex ratios compare the number of males to females in a society. So if a sex ratio is said to be 150, this means that there are 150 males for every 100 females. More commonly used is something referred to as population pyramids. These are used, it's a graphic representation of a population that's divided into age and sex, and it's used to illustrate a country's population dynamics. So, as you can see here, is a population pyramid for Mexico, the middle is the United States, the third is the world. It typically consists of two back-to-back bar graphs with the population plotted on the x-axis and the age on the y-axis. So one shows the number of males and the other side shows the number of females in a particular population in 5-year age groups or cohorts. Males are shown on the left and females on the right, and they are measured in raw numbers or as a percentage of the total population. They're often viewed as the most effective way to graphically depict the age and sex distribution of a population. As you can see, it's a very clear image, and a great deal of information can be broken down by these age and sex depictions that can be read from this population pyramid. It can also shed light onto the extent of development and other aspects in a population. So, there tends to be more females than males in older age groups, especially in the United States, due to females' longer life expectancy. But it's also important to note that, in fact, worldwide, there are more males born in every society than females born. If you look at the population periods, you will note how the shape is much less triangular for the United States than for Mexico. When you look at Mexico or at the world, you can see how it has a wide base, indicating a large number of children born. But as it rises, it tapers through the age groups. This classic pyramid shape that you see of Mexico in the world is what originally gave these population pyramids their name. And it's very typical of a developing country, where lots of children are born, but the death rates are high, and few people live into old age. Estimated population growth is based on 3 demographic variables. First, fertility rate. Fertility rate is the number of children that an average woman bears. So, to compute a country's fertility rate, demographers often look at the crude birth rate, or the annual number of births per 1,000 people. The overall fertility rate is 2.6. This means that the average woman throughout the world has 2.6 children in her lifetime. As compared to the United States is 2.1. The highest or largest birth rate is found in Africa, and the lowest is found in Asia. Mortality. Mortality is also measured by the crude death rate, or the number of deaths per 1,000 people. The highest mortality rate is 31 per 1,000 people in Central Africa. And at 2, the world's lowest, tied by 3 oil-rich countries, Kuwait, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates. Third is the migration rate, and this is measured by net migration. This is the number of immigrants moving in versus the number of immigrants moving out per 1,000 members of the population. There are push factors that make people want to leave where they are living. For example, poverty, persecution, lack of economic opportunity. And then there are pull factors that attract people to different social situations, such as opportunities for higher wages or better jobs in a new location. The growth rate is measured or equates to births minus deaths plus net migration. Social factors such as wars, economic booms and busts, plagues and famines push death rates and birth rates up and down. The primary factor that influences a country's growth is its rate of industrialization. As a country industrializes, the growth rate declines. New economic opportunities open up, but having and raising children also becomes more expensive at the same time. So, because of the difficulties in forecasting population growth, demographers have formulated several predictions simultaneously, each depending on different assumptions of the way social life will take place.